This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Exhibitions and Events Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we meet on today is Kaurna land. We wish to express our respect for the Kaurna people, their elders and ancestors, and acknowledge the spiritual and cultural relationship the Kaurna people have with their traditional land. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia to hear from Australian literary icon Geoff Goodfellow as he launches his latest book, Out of Copley Street. I would like to warmly welcome Geoff and offer a pre-congratulations on the launch of your fabulous new book, and to thank you for choosing the Hawke Centre to present this marvellous event, and I'm thrilled that we can provide the platform for a much-loved South Australian writer. I would also like to warmly welcome Professor Rick Sarre, who will facilitate the in-conversation, and to thank the publishers Wakefield Press. So, it is now my pleasure to welcome to the stage, first up, Uni Essays Professor Rick Sarre, who will introduce Geoff. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Jacinta, and good evening to everyone. Out of Copley Street, it gives me enormous pleasure to have the honour of launching Geoff's 2020 memoir. I've known Geoff for more than 2 decades. I've enjoyed his wistful and sometimes gritty poetry through the many titles that have cemented his name to my mind amongst the great contemporary poets who speak with an authentic Australian voice. Many of you will have read of his profound insights as he's placed them in his dozens of poetic works, including the first one I read, No Collars, No Cuffs, Poems for a Dead Father, Waltzing with Jack Dancer, and many more. As many of you know, in 2008, Geoff found himself with throat cancer, but he faced the enemy with the sort of courage one would expect from a man who'd come up against some pretty tough situations in the past and usually succeeded in defeating them. He dedicated Waltzing with Jack Dancer to Geoff Rees, his surgeon, offering the following by way of dedication. He said, "Geoff, once you're in my corner, I knew I could go the distance." I can say without fear of contradiction that there would be no other poet alive today in Australia who can present their poetic work to an audience with the same passion and colour as Geoff. The pleasure that audiences have experienced in the past is now under some threat, as Geoff's voice is labouring from the rigours of the treatment he received as a cancer patient. But it's still operational, albeit a little husky, and you'll hear Geoff read from his book before the evening is over. Out of Copley Street is a memoir that takes his readers from Geoff's earliest memories in Broadview to the end of his teens. It's the 1950s and 1960s suburban voice that sings off the pages. When I began reading it, I'd expected the narrative to be a feisty challenge to the conservative voices of the day, when the working class was the fodder for the industrial base that South Australia was building, when the police ran their own show with their own rules, when his family's Catholic church dictated social policy, and when university education for the children of blue-collar families was nothing but a pipe dream. However, it didn't read like that. I was delighted to read Geoff's prose narrative, which is less about bitterness and more about the values that made us tick then and still do now. The value of loyalty, of trust, of honesty, and the endearment that exists between members of families, workmates, and the people who walk the suburban streets of Adelaide. These were the days when people indeed did go by foot to the local shops, the one telephone booth that served the neighbourhood, and of course, the local pub. This was a day where kids of 5 years of age, like Geoff, could help the milkman out on his milk run. The book is a series of vignettes, stories that are colourful and reflective. And speaking of colourful, Geoff's boyhood hair colour was of a red hue. You wouldn't know that today. Hence his nickname, Bluey. Above all, the stories have a kind of David Williamson authenticity to them. Baby boomers, and I can see a few of you out there tonight, will find yourselves saying, yes, that's exactly right. With a couple of exceptions that both relate to people who receive what one might describe as their just desserts, the tale is a life-affirming, which is what one is likely to read from a man who's come face to face a few years ago with his own mortality. Readers of the baby boomer generation will enjoy the descriptions of what some would assert was the simpler and uncomplicated life that existed in the 1950s and 1960s. These were the days when choices were fewer, when communication was always verbal, not text or email, and when opportunities didn't always knock. Indeed, there might be a temptation for the reader to suspect that Geoff is one of those people of a certain age, namely a baby boomer, which I understand these days is becoming something of a pejorative. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Not amongst us, I'm sure. Who long for the days, people of a certain age, who long for the days of Playful and Menzies, of Sunday afternoon drives if you owned a car, of church fetes, of men who worked in the same industry for all of their working life and who enjoyed the company of their mates after work at the local watering hole, of families who sat by their black and white TVs watching Sunday night at the movies or a fundraising telethon. No, the book does not delve into that nostalgia. The book does not romanticise this period. It does not gloss over the reality of what it was like for young people who found themselves being strongly advised to leave school at 15. Strongly advised is what Geoff was, and I use it as a euphemism. Or off to an apprenticeship with a disorganised principal, and often on the wrong side of the law with the local constabulary constantly monitoring his activities, or in a house where a wife needed to cope with a very often inebriated husband, or where a migrant friend suffered constantly the slurs of racist neighbours. Geoff does, however, remind us that Copley Street and streets just like it all over Adelaide harboured good people. There are stories of honour and pride, stories of people in the pub who bought a very young boy's products, mainly because he was insistent and cute. And stories, cute, there we are, Geoff. People laughed at that. And Geoff tells his readers it's these attributes, going the extra mile, literally, pride and honour, that will inevitably prevail over showiness, self-aggrandisement and bluster. The stories are often presented in a self-deprecatory way. To read of Geoff's fall from grace in his first and only professional boxing bout leaves the reader wincing in pain. I'm told the person who inflicted that pain is in the audience tonight. He's a good mate of Geoff's and he'll be identified, I'm sure, before the evening is over. There are some great photos in the book too. Geoff's laconic smile, which you can see here, was evident even in his baby photographs and as a young man on a motorbike. Let me conclude with this thought. The surname Goodfellow has a certain resonance, a name that aptly describes its subject, I'm told, is referred to as an aptronym, like Margaret Court of tennis fame, Usain Bolt, the sprinter, and I got these off the internet, I should add, and Jules Angst, German professor of psychiatry who wrote about anxiety. Geoff is indeed a good fellow. His friends and his family know that. You wouldn't be here tonight if you didn't believe that. The book reinforces that. It's been a pleasure to read about the family members, friends and bosses who taught him well, and the many and varied, if not harrowing experiences that made him the man he is today. So I congratulate Geoff on the book. I also congratulate Michael Bollen on putting it together, and Wakefield Press. I'm sure Geoff has a lot more to say about him and Wakefield Press during his remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, I formally launch out of Copley Street. And I invite Geoff to the stage to respond.
If I missed kissing if you weren't on the way in, I'll be in the foyer later on. Thanks, Rick, for the fantastic launch and those lovely introductory notes. And thanks to Michael Boland at Wakefield Press for producing this very handsome book. And to Liz Nicholson for her design work. And to Jo Case for her careful editing. My thanks too to Simon Cesare for his excellent work on restoring the original Box Brownie photographs which feature through the various chapters. Another thank you too to Adelaide jazz legends, Charlie Hollebeck and Harry Van Veneti, along with a string of musicians for their CD of 6 of my poems, The Punter, which will be on sale too, and it is being launched here tonight. At 34 years of age in 1983, when I began to write and perform around Adelaide, I was often one of the youngest people in the room. Now, the reverse is true. Tonight, though, I've been well eclipsed by the presence of my first employer, the local Broadview Milky of the 1950s, a famed rangeman and Hall of Famer in the trotting world, Lenny Sugars. Lenny is 95, so I'm not going to ask him to stand. Lenny was my first boss. He gave me my first job at 5 years of age. He's the best yodeler you've ever heard in your life. And a top rangeman in the milk cart, and wasn't bad on the track either. Good on you, Lenny. Poetry is perhaps what I'm best known for, and my entrance into the world of prose has been a long time in the making. Looking back over my writing career, I'd like to acknowledge my older son Mark as my first literary critic. I can still remember waking him up at around 2:30 one morning in Mary Street at Unley to read him an early draft of my now infamous poem, Don't Call Me Lad. He wasn't upset at this intrusion, but did order me to make him a coffee before he'd have a look at the poem. This young apprentice chef then pointed out a couple of areas where rework was required. And my second son, Shane, never a shy boy, would jump up with me at poetry venues like the Cathedral Hotel and Friendly Street, where we'd perform a poem for 2 voices. Shane always writing his own lines and delivering them with confidence and conviction. My third son, Paul, as an adolescent, gave me a good deal of help when I was having a crack at writing for young children. My story, The Ghost of Walkerville, was made much more authentic in terms of language with Paul's input. My youngest, my daughter Grace, who is now 29, grew up surrounded by books and words. Grace has the honour of being the youngest person ever to be published by Overland magazine, achieved while a Year 9 student at St Aloysius College. She is also a 3-time winner of the South Australian division of the Somerset National Novella Competition for school-age writers, as well as becoming the outright national winner in 2008, the same week I was diagnosed with cancer. During my recovery, she was again shortlisted for the National Prize for her story, The C Word, which bookends Waltzing with Jack Dancer, which of course is out there on sale tonight too on the table. She has also had a career as a singer-songwriter, appearing at Adelaide clubs and pubs. So I wish to thank and acknowledge all of my children for contributing to my journey as a writer and for being contributors too to our wider culture. My late father, John, a talented storyteller, was a great influence on me, as was my mother, Lois, a seamstress who knew about exactness. My father was a gunner during World War II and a rat of Tobruk. But he was a gunner right through my childhood too, often saying, I'm going to write a book one day. A lot of people say they're going to write a book. Few people do. To write a book, you need determination, willpower, discipline, effort, concentration, and so much more. I'm sure if my parents were alive today, I would have made them extremely proud with the release of Out of Copley Street. And I'm sure my big sister Annette, who is absent tonight due to poor health, and my two late younger brothers, Big Blue and Little Blue, or Mark and Brian, would share their pride. When I wrote Out of Copley Street, I imagined an audience. I remembered looking out over a huge crowd at Adelaide Writers' Week in 1990. I then had a booming, stentorian voice and absolutely terrified many of the middle-aged, middle-class women and men who were present. My poetry can often present a savage representation of our society, but I don't regret or resile from writing poetry which accurately portrays the dark underbelly of the Australia I have moved through during the course of my life. In 2008, a cancer operation effectively took away my capacity for volume. Later that year, after a synthetic voice box was implanted in my throat, I knew my bellowing days were well and truly over. Out of Copley Street, or a good deal of it, is written in my little boy's voice. It's been written to win back those people I scared in 1990. It's gentle, it's conversational, and uses the language I was brought up with. One might call it kangaroo English. It's colloquial, it's slang, and it reflects my working class roots and origins. My old man used to say we four kids were not brought up, we were brung up. We had our difficulties in Copley Street, most families did. But my book doesn't dwell on negatives. I'm not a whinger. This is not a carping, whining, miserable read. Rather, it's a fond recollection and a look back on a life I'm proud of. I'll hand proceedings back to Rick now, but before I do, let me say a big thank you to all my old Copley Street friends who are here tonight in the auditorium.
Well, thank you, Geoff. What we're going to do now is have a bit of a conversation. I've got a few questions here. We've also got a question that was submitted online. And we're going to interpolate my questions with some readings, and they're going to be kind of nicely segued through this. So you'll hear a bit more of Geoff's authentic voice, so long as he keeps it lubricated.
That's right.
With his bottled water there. So, Geoff, the question I think which is on everyone's lips, I'm sure, is poetry has been your vehicle for all of these years. I understand you had a conversation with the great Ken Kesey. Why suddenly it's prose?
Well, Ken Kesey pointed out that if I was still writing poetry when I was 60, I'd be living in a trailer. I've got a Greek landlord, so doing a bit better than that, but you don't make a lot of money from poetry. And when my voice started to fade, when it dropped off, I used to be able to stand on the back of a truck in the Pilbara and read to 700 men at 6:30 in the morning before they started work. No speaker system at all. But I can't do that now. I'm flat out doing it with a microphone now. So I knew that I had to change the style of writing that I was doing. And I think I've written some more gentle poetry over the past few years. And then I thought, well, I'll give prose a crack because Ken Kesey was right. And, I am not a bad storyteller, I think, from what people tell me anyway, when I do go wah, 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 you should write that, you should write that, you should write that. Old Billy Bicycle clip over here is at me all the time, you should write that one down, Geoff. And, sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. And I thought, well, I'll give it a go. So the result is Out of Copley Street, and I think it's a cracker.
And there are a number of other people. I'm listing them here: Tim Winton, Helen Garner, in fact, Barbara Hanrahan.
Well, Barbara was a big influence too. I met Barbara in 1987 at Murphy Sisters bookshop and got a hard copy of Dream People, and I thought Barbara just captured that Adelaide that Bob Henderson knows. Bob Henderson has mentioned in one of her books he was her grade 5 girlfriend. But Barbara captured Mile End, Theberton absolutely beautifully. And I started to think, You know, nothing has been written much about the northern suburbs, and there's nothing wrong with the northern suburbs. It was a great place to grow up. I thought, well, I'll have a crack at that and see how we go.
Well, let's hear something of the 1950s and 1960s, Adelaide northern suburbs. We're going to go to the little hamming it up, Geoff. Let's hear from you in relation to that little piece.
Okay, well, I'll give you a slab of it. It was a Sunday morning in 1956. We'd just got home from 8 a.m. Mass. I changed out of my good clothes and put on a pair of shorts, a T-shirt and my school sandals. Mum and Dad were drinking a pot of tea in the kitchen and reading the paper when I walked out the back door, careful not to let the screen door slam. It was already quite warm, and the backyard with all its fruit trees seemed a cooler place to be. Besides that, while I'd been kneeling down that morning, not understanding any of the Latin Father Killian was using, I'd been thinking about the one peach that was still left up on that tree. I'd spotted it when I was in the chook shed getting the eggs before church. It was high up and going to be hard to get, but it didn't look as though the birds had beaten me to it. I dragged an empty banana box out of the shed, across the yard, then upended it below the peach tree. It was a white peach. Its fruit really fleshy and juicy, with smooth and furry skin dusted with tinges of soft pink. This last one looked like the best one too. I got the yard broom out of the shed and climbed on top of the box. I pushed the broom head up through a tangle of branches to try and tap it gently. I knew I'd have to be quick then to catch it without falling off the box and hurting myself. But I was just a little bit too short to reach it. If the box had been 6 inches higher, I could have got it for sure. My best chance now is to scale the tree on one of the biggest branches and try and reach out for it. I just started to get really close when I heard the slap of the screen door closing, then Dad's voice yelling out, "Geoff, where are you?" And on it goes. I think we'll leave it at that point, because there are a number of stories, and I want to read you little slabs of bits and pieces of stories. And
well, let's go back. We're talking here about children growing up in a kind of a pre-internet, pre-social media, getting an education on the streets. And I want you to go to Bluey Gets a Start, because here we are talking about you as a very, very young man.
Yeah. I've always been an early riser, particularly through summer. As a young child, barely of school age, I shared a bedroom with my older sister at the front of the house. This meant that I'd inevitably wake to the clip-clop of hooves and the clink of milk bottles being dropped off by Lenny Sugars. Copley Street was then an unmade road, collared by knee-high grass. I'd often creep outside at 5:30 a.m. and rip off a big handful of grass and hand-feed it to Lenny's draft horse. I was only 5 years old, and most days Lenny would have one or two older boys working the milk round with him. One morning when he's working alone, I asked if I could come along in the cart and give him a hand. "I don't know about that, Bluey," he said. "How old are you?" "I reckon you'd only be about 5, wouldn't you?" "Yeah," I said, "but I'm nearly 5 and a half. Maybe I'll speak to your mum and dad on Saturday morning when I'm doing my accounts, see what they've got to say about it first." When Lenny knocked on the door with his brown leather money bag on Saturday morning, Dad was running a paint roller up and down the walls of the main bedroom. Dad invited Lenny inside, but asked him to wait a minute while he washed the paint off his hands in the kitchen sink. "Have a shift here while I'm doing, Lenny. Geoff, take Lenny up the hallway while I clean myself up a bit." When Dad came into the bedroom, Lenny said, "Nice job of the cutting in, Johnny. Maybe you should have been a painter." "I don't think I want to be doing that 5 or 6 days a week," Dad said. "There's got to be an easier way to make a quid than painting." Then Dad told Lenny how he chose the colour for the walls, but insisted Mum chose the colour for the ceiling. Lenny thought that was really funny, but I didn't see the joke at all. As Dad was squaring Lenny off for the milk, Lenny told him I wanted to work the milk round with him. Dad didn't have any objections. He thought it would be a good experience for me and seemed happy that Lenny would make sure I got dropped back home by 7. Lenny told me he'd pay me $2 bob each week and I'd get it on the Saturday. I started the following morning. And I'll just... I went on from there to work at in pubs and selling pies and pasties. And that story is quite a long story. So I'll leave it there and we'll
let me say, as I was reading the book, I was kind of expecting you to be feisty in the same way your poetry has always been feisty. You come across...
I can be, don't worry about
come
that.
across as
Give me any check and I'll jump up and...
You come across as a very mellow person. Are you mellowing in your older age? Is that what it is? You've chosen stories from your childhood which really show you as a bit of a softie.
Well, I am a bit of a softie. Deep down, like I'm like butter, really. Tracy Dorian up there, the head of English at Sacred Heart College, she knows. I am soft as butter. But I tell hard stories.
Well, let's hear another one, Love in the 60s. I think, let's talk a bit about love. That's not a bad way to go.
Well, that's been my undoing.
I can tell you there's not much about his undoing in that regard in the book, if you're looking for something salacious.
I spotted this motorbike in Greenacres and went in and spoke to the bloke who owned the motorbike and arranged to buy it. I said I'd have to get my mum and dad's approval and I needed £1 10 shillings, and I knew that I didn't have that much in the underwear drawer, but I was probably close to the mark. So anyway, I talked mum and dad into it, went back, and it picks up on that point that I've got back to pick the motorbike up. Don't you boys go riding on the way home. You can see the tyres need some air, so it won't be an easy push either. I'm glad you brought your mate. He looks a strong lad too. OK, I've got to get back in the shed and knock this job over. Have fun with her, boys, but don't go too crazy. Me and Pete took turns pushing, even talking about how we could probably ride her through the back streets without getting caught, but we didn't want to stretch our luck. When we eventually came out of Colac Avenue and crossed Hampstead Road, we were both wishing the BP had been open so we could have put some air in the tyres. Still, it was only a short way down Watson Avenue until we'd turn into Copley Street. I'd left one of the swing doors on the garage pegged open and we pushed the bike straight into the shed. Luckily, Dad didn't have a car at the time. He'd been caught drink driving, and he told me the garage was going to be empty for a fair while. Mum and Dad came out and had a quick look at her. They didn't have much to say other than it seemed to be a good buy. I knew she'd stripped down to become a great scrambler, and so did Pete. We started on her straight away, getting the spanners out and unbolting everything we didn't need. The headlamp and the tail lamp came off first, Pete working at one end of the bike and me at the other. Then we took off the number plates, the side stand and the kickstand. We dragged an old Besser block in from the backyard and with a bit of a struggle succeeded in getting it under the frame so we had the wheels off the ground. After we disconnected the handbrake and the rear brake lever, we were able to get both wheels out. While I was unbolting and disconnecting the speedo and the rear vision mirrors, Pete got the muffler box off. Then we set about unbolting the mudguards. We finished up rounding off the nuts, as we only had open-ended spanners. Not to be beaten, we got Dad's cold chisel and a heavy mash hammer, and then Pete set to work on the frozen nuts, whacking away until the bolt snapped and we were able to pull the guards free. By this time it was getting dark and we decided to give it away for the night. After checking that Mum was cooking tea and Dad was watching the TV news, we got out our packet of Viscounts and from our stash and sat alongside her, having a smoke and talking about how much fun we'd have with her.
Geoff, you weren't very old then. How old were you then?
About 11, I reckon.
Now, speaking of Dad, you write very affectionately of him, but there were some difficult aspects. I'm going to get you to do a couple of readings about him first. But first tell us about Dad, and then we'll come to the readings. Yeah,
well, as I said earlier, Dad was a rat of Tobruk. He was a TPI pensioner. He loved to drink. He was a technical and scientific glassblower by occupation, so he had very good motor skills. He was a brilliant salesperson, and when he drank himself into bankruptcy in the neon sign business, he then set about becoming a phone blower and sold advertising over the phone. Was very good at it. Would only work generally one day a week. He believed that you should never start work before 10 o'clock in the morning, and knock off was 4 o'clock, and he never worked on Fridays because you'd be bothering people and you had 2 hours for lunch. So he didn't have a real strong work ethic. He didn't like doing lots of hours, but he was a good talker, and he sold more advertising than I reckon anyone in South Australia during that era. But he would lob home most nights elephant's trunk. You know, the drunks bus left the city at 20 past 6. So, you know, the last beers would be up on the counter at 6 o'clock. He'd stagger out if he was too drunk to climb the steps to the MTT bus. He'd have to jump in a smash and grab and get a cab home, and usually the pockets were empty, and Mum would have to find 7 shillings and sixpence to square the cab off, and, you know, on it went the next day. And he'd work generally 1 day a week. He worked on Thursdays, I think, but the rest of the week was for drinking. So he put quite a bit across the counter at the Union, the Majestic, many other pubs around town.
But he was good to you. He was good to you as kids.
He was a top bloke. When he was sober, you couldn't get a better bloke. But drunk, he was pretty hopeless, you know. But a lot of people are like that, you know, so...
Let's hear a bit about him in the book. Let's go to Cutting Through, which I think gives a little bit of background.
I didn't grow up in a house full of books, but there wasn't a single family member who was illiterate. We did have a few books, mainly hardbacks. They sat largely untouched on a shelf in the lounge room. There was A Town Like Alice, Peyton Place, Death Is My Trade, Madame Curie, Around the Bory Log, Power Without Glory, and a handful of other less memorable titles. They mostly sat unread and gathering dust. Sitting in front of the fireplace, half shivered, the old man would occasionally request one of us kids to grab him around the Bory Log. He'd then recite a poem or two, using an authentic Southern Irish brogue, and following that, sing us Danny Boy, or Sweet Molly Malone, or Irish Eyes Are Smiling, inviting us all to sing along with him. He'd then tell us how lucky we were to be descended from a nation of storytellers. To be sure, to be sure, to be sure, he'd say. Then he'd likely have another glass of stout, telling us it's thirsty work, that reciting and singing. On the books of that shelf, I knew the old man had knocked off Death Is My Trade from the Repat Hospital Library. He was often out in Ward 17 for brief spells through the 50s and 60s. I remember him bringing it home when I was 8. Though he read the newspaper carefully every day, that particular title was the only one I can remember seeing him read throughout my childhood. I overheard him talking to Mum about it in the kitchen one afternoon, but when I asked him a question about it, he told me that I shouldn't have been listening into his conversation. I should go outside and play. Get out there and have some fun, he'd told me. The next morning I got up really early, hooked it out of the bookshelf by the top of its maroon spine and started reading bits of it. I read various passages and looked at photographs of Eva Braun, Hitler's girlfriend, and learned how she'd made lampshades out of human skin. Just knowing that gave me an understanding of why my dad had nightmares and why he'd often finish up in that madhouse ward at some time through each year of my early childhood. He'd often be away for a couple of weeks at a time, sometimes even more, having group therapy with other blokes just like himself, and occasionally having electric shock therapy. Then he'd inevitably lob home again, smiling, cracking jokes, and presenting Mum with a big wicker shopping basket he'd made for her in occupational therapy. Dad was always handy with his hands. He won the South Australian featherweight boxing title with him when he was in 1938 when he was 17. Then on the 1st of June 1940, he put his hands forward again and enlisted in the AIF, becoming SX 3986 and joining the 2nd 7th Field Regiment.
Geoff, I want to skip to your mother now. Obviously, this was always going to be a difficulty for her dealing with his inebriation. Tell us a bit about her, then I'm going to get you to read a little bit about some of the things that she needed to cope with.
Well, she had a difficult life for sure, because he was lovable when he was sober. There was nowhere to go in those days anyway. There was no money there was no run money, so she had to stay there. She was locked into that relationship, and they had a very endearing love for one another. But when he was good, he was very, very good, and when he was bad, he was fucking dreadful. I can't make any mistake about that.
Language warning, probably a bit late.
Mum was a seamstress by occupation, so she was very exacting in her work. She is also a very good listener, and if I said that Father Christmas came down the chimney, she'd say, no, he doesn't come down the chimney, he comes down the chimney. And then she'd spell it and get you to write it, and I said, I brought that at the shop. No, you didn't brought it at the shop, you bought it at the shop, and she would give us those little lessons. So I think a lot of her input, as well as my father's input, has made me the writer that I am today.
I'm going to get you to read an astonishing story, The Long Drive Home, where Mum decided that she was going to drive home and you convinced her that you were going to drive home.
Yeah, well, Mum could not drive her finger into her nose, and we'd been out to my nana's place, and Uncle Fred was home, and the old man and Uncle Fred got into the Hawke. So I'll read you a couple of little passages from it. There was a creek over the road from Nana's, but she didn't like us going over there. She said it was too dangerous. I did sneak over there a few times, and I talked to some of the local kids. They'd tied a long rope onto the arm of an old red river gum, and some of the kids used to swing out and drop into the water before swimming back to the bank. The creek was quite skinny, but they'd put their rope up over a waterhole that was wide and deep. Even the biggest kid, who was 13, couldn't stand on the bottom. Anne came over the river with me a few times, but mostly she'd stay in the lounge room near the bookshelf. Anne was a year older than me, and she always looked at the transparent pictures in Gray's Anatomy. She showed me some of them too. You could see all the bits of people, boys and girls, if you know what I mean. And I'll jump forward.
So you're heading home and Dad's a little under the weather.
Yeah, but I want to give you a bit of a flavour of the family too. So I'll read another passage. Auntie Brenda lived with Nana too, as well as Uncle Fred. We didn't see them very often because they were working. Auntie Brenda was a shorthand typist in the government office and used to bring home lots of pens and pencils and sharpeners and texters for us, as well as lots of paper. She told Mum it was easy to get that sort of stuff for us because she had the key to the stationery cabinet. Auntie Brenda was really generous to us kids. Uncle Fred was a painter. He worked for the government too, and sometimes used to paint schools. When I was in grade 1, I used to see him every day because he and his mates were painting my primary school. Uncle Fred was always grumpy when I saw him, and he never really said much to me. He was a bit fat and had a red face, and if you didn't know him, you could easily think he was happy. When he got home from work and we were still at Nana's, he'd just say hello, then go and have a shave, get changed, and go to the pub. You'd reckon when you were 10 that your uncle would at least talk to you a little bit. No wonder he didn't have a girlfriend. That's what I always used to think. Anyway, they've got drunk. Uncle Fred and the old man have got blind, and Mum did not have a licence and had tried to learn and was just not capable of pulling that off. And the old man assured her that he could get us home. You know, he just got his licence back after having it ripped off him for drink driving anyway. And we're on the way home. We're doing pretty well. As we approached Scotty's motel, he flicked the indicators on to signal a right turn into Nottage Terrace. When he made the turn, he wasn't concentrating and drove on the wrong side of the median strip into the oncoming traffic. Luckily, there were few cars on the road, and with all of us screaming for him to stop before he killed us, he swung back onto the correct side of the road and drew to a halt alongside the curb. With that, he switched off the ignition and slurred, "Well, what are we going to do now?" "I'll drive," I volunteered, knowing it was pretty much a straight-through run on the main north east road, and along Hampstead Road until we could turn into Copley Street. At first, Mum was quite reluctant, but I pointed out that we still had about 4 miles to go and couldn't walk it, especially him. Mum questioned whether I could do it, but she soon came to the conclusion that we had no other viable option. The old man then dragged himself out and fell into the back seat. I grabbed his sports coat from the hanger in the back and folded it over a couple of times and put it on the seat as a cushion. I pulled the seat fully forward, adjusted the interior mirror and the driver's side door mirror, looked over at Mum, said, "I'll be right," and cranked the car over. I drew away from the curb, letting the clutch out slowly, and managed a smooth takeoff and all the gear changes without any problems. I had to sit bolt upright to be able to see over the dashboard clearly, but had no problems making the turn onto Main North East Road and merging in with the flow of the traffic. From there it was an easy run up to the Hampstead Hotel, where I signalled a left turn and eased around the corner. I kept under the speed limit all the way until I had to stop at the Regency Road junction. The driver of the car opposite gave me an inquiring look, so I sat waiting to take off. But I avoided any further eye contact and eased the clutch out, not even getting into top gear before turning left into Copley Street. I pulled the car into the driveway, yanked on the handbrake and switched off the ignition. We almost had to pour Dad into a bucket and carry him inside. Dad lasted about another 4 years before clipping a car late one Friday night as he was driving home from the RSL club. He decided then he wouldn't drive again. We were all relieved.
Geoff, just refresh my memory, how old were you again driving the car?
I think 10.
Yes. Good thing there's a statute of limitations on that. I can see at least one Chief Justice and at least one magistrate in this room, so there we go. Now, your education system, I want to come to that. Coming out of school, about 15, you were advised to leave school. You went on to an apprenticeship. I'm watching the time, Geoff, so we're going to just jump forward a little bit. You had an apprenticeship with a somewhat disorganised principal. What do you think about education then, perhaps compared to now, moving into apprenticeships compared to now? Tell us a bit about that experience.
Well, I guess at that point, boys, especially in the northern suburbs, were just trained to be factory fodder. So, there was a general acceptance of leaving school at 14 or 15. If you wanted to leave early, you got to ask for an exemption and you could get away at 14 and get a job. And there were plenty of jobs then. And, they told us boys at Narsworth Boys Tech, where I went, along with a few other people in the room, that all we needed to do was sit the year out and everyone would have a job at the railway workshops. There were 5,000 jobs at the railway workshops. It was a job for everyone. You could be an apprentice, anything you want. You could be a boilermaker, welder, a fitter and turner, a machinist. You could be a carpenter, a sign writer, a French polisher, that weld your oyster. Just try and behave yourselves. Well, we didn't, and there were probably 42 boys to a class, and most of the lads left and went to work at the Islington Railway workshops. And in 1991, when I was working with the Metal Workers Union, they said, "How would you like to go to the railway workshops and do you've got me, I was so keen to get there because I thought I'll see Bob Hunter up and I'll see all these other people that I haven't seen for years. I got down the railway workshop expecting to read to 5,000 people, and there were around about 120 people. They'd had some downsizing, some right-sizing, some employment adjustment. I thought, where are those poor bastards now? They're like me, on the rock and roll. And, they deluded so many people. You can go down the railway workshops now to do a reading. You won't find 120 there. You won't find anyone there because it's done and dusted. And people like me that didn't like school, they're not looked after. They're not looked after today, and they weren't looked after then.
Geoff, let's go to your first job. What goes around? Let's start with this one. You were into the butcher shop.
Into the butcher shop.
What goes around?
Yeah. I didn't leave school the day after turning 15 in September of 1964. Around 1/3 of the 42 boys I'd started the year with did though, most of them heading down the road from Nailsworth Tech to the Islington Railway workshops to begin an apprenticeship. About 5,000 blokes punched on and punched off at the workshops every day. Quite a few of them punched on at the Reapham or the Albion after they'd had a few knock-off beers. Whenever I'd raised the issue of leaving school, Mum and Dad had insisted that I stay on to gain my intermediate certificate. I hated school though, did little to no work, and I was hardly surprised at the end of the year when they passed out the school reports to find I was 3 subjects short. I'd punched on with the English teacher, the maths teacher, and come quite close to it with the science teacher. So I considered they'd squared up with me on their own terms. The teachers' comments too were written in a way that ensured I'd never be able to produce that report and jag a job on the strength of it. I did take it along once, but only on a callback after having forgotten to take it with me the first time. The bloke just read it and shook his head. He looked down over me over his horn rim glass and said, "You will never get a job in the printing industry with this report. In fact, I doubt anyone would give you a job after reading this. Good day." A couple of days later, I saw an advert in the Situations Vacant at the Advertiser for an apprentice butcher in Greenacres, an adjoining suburb to mine. Being so close to home would mean I'd be able to walk to work, and the idea of getting a trade and becoming a butcher seemed quite appealing. I'd been going to Jimmy's meat store on Hampstead Road with Mum for years, carrying home a side of lamb, some pickled pork, sausages, mince and frits for her. I'd always enjoyed the cheeky atmosphere of the shop, and I liked Jimmy too. He'd always lean over the counter and offer up a slice of frits on the blade of his knife, right back from when I was still in a pusher. After I was 6 or 7, I'd often ask if I could have a squirt of tomato sauce with it. He used to grin and say things like, "Listen, Bluey, you'll want portholes in your coffin." I found the humour of butchers most endearing, even in my adolescent years. And I was awake to what they were really suggesting when they asked the ladies if they liked the thick ones or the thin ones. Anyway, I jagged the job. I worked there for a few months.
Let's go to dancing shoes, which is moving from there to the next job. Starting on 9.
One afternoon when Jim had gone to the toilet, which was at the other end of the block of 6 shops, I was working the counter with Mr. Jones. We were both serving ladies, and another lady was waiting. As a siren wailed along nearby Hampstead Road, Mr. Jones turned to me with a smirk and said, "That'll be the police going up the Hotel Enfield to arrest your father. He must be drunk again and causing trouble." That was more than I could take, and I slipped my left foot forward, found my balance, and hit him flush on the jaw with a beautiful right hand. He dropped to the sawdust, and I was halfway through picking him up to give him another serve when Jim, hearing the commotion, barged in and grabbed me by the shoulders and dragged me clear. Mr. Jones then scrambled to his feet and, fully flushed, ushered the 3 ladies out of the shop at 2:30 p.m. before snipping the lock and dropping the Venetian blinds. Jim kept a firm grip on me for about 5 minutes or so while I continued to abuse Mr. Jones, letting him know in no uncertain terms that he couldn't speak poorly about my family in public without expecting a belt in the mouth. I told him to stick his job up his arse and I stormed out. I went home to an empty house, pleased that I didn't have to explain my untimely arrival. Anyway, Mr. Jones came round that night, tried to square off with the old man. The old man copped it sweet. I got home at about 11 o'clock. The old man said, "Come here, sit down." He said, "Jonesy came round here tonight," and he told me how Jonesy had come round and apologised to him, and he said, "So, all sweet, you're back there in the morning." I said, "Might be sweet with you, John." I said, "But it's not sweet with me." I said, "He can stick his job where the monkey sticks his nuts." I said, "I'm not going to..." I said, "I know I have to give a week's notice." I said, "That's the law." And so I went in the next morning and he tried to coerce me into working and keeping on working. I said, no, go away and leave me alone. Well, by around about 10 o'clock, he set me to work scrubbing the walls of the butcher shop on top of a ladder. I worked on until noon and said I was going to go to lunch. I knew I had to get to Clovercrest within the hour to stand a chance of winning this job. I went the only way I could think of, by foot. I took off, running down Ministerial Street, going left along Muller's Road and then left again on Main North East Road for several miles. I eventually turned into Kelly Road and slogged it up the hill to Montague Road. My dancing shoes had become my running shoes and they served me well. The boxing training had helped me too. I found myself at the back door of the butcher shop at 1:45. My short-sleeved white shirt was glued to my body. I ran my comb through my hair as I took some deep breaths, trying to slow my breathing down. After composing myself, I twisted the silver door handle and let myself into the back room of the shop. 2 blokes were trimming meat at the benches. It was a big work area, more than likely 5 times bigger than what I'd been used to. "G'day," I said, somewhat breathlessly. "I'm here for an interview for the apprentice butcher's job." "Hang on, mate, I'll grab the boss, he's out in the shop." 2 blokes came through, one in his early 30s, wearing a white butcher's jacket and a white plastic apron. The other man was older, probably in his 50s, wearing sports trousers with a pale blue shirt and a patterned tie. The younger man introduced himself as Mike, telling me he was a shop manager. He then introduced Ray Beaumont, the overall shop manager for Turner's. I shook hands with both of them, telling them I was Geoff Goodfellow. I said I'd rung up late yesterday and was given an appointment for an interview at 1 o'clock. "Excuse me," said Ray, "but how come your shirt is soaking wet?" "I'm sorry," I replied. "I've just run from Ministerial Street at Greenacres to get here on time." "Couldn't someone have driven you?" "My man has lost his licence. There was no one else I could think of this morning, and I really do want the job." Ray laughed and looked at Mike. "I reckon he's told us enough already." He then looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're on, Geoff. You can start next Monday at 8. Come on and we'll show you around and introduce you to the blokes. You'll fit in fine."
Geoff, I want to talk about a few run-ins that you had from time to time, which meant that the police were sometimes just looking out for you in a way which I think your book describes as being patently unfair. I'm going to get you to read The First Taste of a Magistrate, which, if you can find that one, it'll give you some idea about how you stayed on the right side of the law, but not with any help much from the police. We're talking page 128 and 129.
Yeah, here we go. So this is the opening to the story out of Copley Street. I'd met the bloke twice in a fortnight. The first time he'd seemed to be a grumpy old bastard, but I was barely 17, only shaving twice a week, and obviously he had a lot to learn. He told me as much too when I saw him the second time, and it was for almost exactly the same thing. I had my old man with me on both occasions, stone cold sober too, and even he was dirty on me that second time around. As we clumped up the wooden staircase to the first floor, my old man told me he'd checked the case list in the foyer and we'd copped the same bloke again, Magistrate Scales. The first time I'd had to front, we joked as we came up the stairs about how his name sounded a bit fishy. When my name was finally called and we walked into his courtroom, we bowed our heads like we were going up to get communion. When I looked up again, our eyes met, and I realised he was perhaps more reptilian. My old man had warned me on that second appearance that I'd better act more contrite. Look the old lizard straight in the eyes and tell him it wouldn't happen again. It wasn't as if I'd murdered anyone or knocked anything off of any value. I'd simply been pinched for speeding with a pillion passenger for a second time. Pete was supposed to have kept an eye out for the coppers, but he obviously hadn't turned his head around enough. After I'd pleaded guilty, being as humble as I possibly could, I let the lizard know that I was driving a small delivery truck and the job depended on me having a licence. My man got the sense that things weren't going particularly well. He was a super salesman and sought permission to speak on my behalf. He started to charm the lizard just like he charmed Mum. To tell the truth, he committed perjury for me. He told the court when I arrived home and said I'd been booked for speeding with a pillion passenger again. He'd confiscated the ignition key and unscrewed the spark plugs. He went on to tell a good magistrate that the motorbike hadn't been ridden since that night. The magistrate thanked my old man and then addressed me. He said that if my father hadn't stopped me from riding the motorcycle for 6 weeks, that he would have had no hesitation in suspending my licence for at least 3 months. However, given that I'd already suffered some inconvenience, he would reduce my suspension to 6 weeks and impose a fine of $25. I don't wish to see you back here again, young man, he said. You are now free to go, but I must warn you, if I do happen to see you here again, there will be serious consequences.
Geoff, I think your father missed his calling.
Yeah.
We are rushing towards the end of the time, but I don't want to leave this discussion without something about your first bout with boxing, how that came about, and I want you to identify the person who hit you.
We'll just get Louis to stand up. Where's Louis? Louis, stand up. There he is. Okay, sit down.
Okay, I think we're going to have a little story about the gloves are off and how Louis became famous in your life.
I'd seen Louis fight. I'd seen him fight several times in the ring, and I'd seen him knock people out generally in the first round or the second round. Generally it was in the first round. I hadn't seen a lot of the fights at the Seaton Hotel or Henley Square or other pubs around the western suburbs, but he was known as Wild Bull Sarre, so I knew that he could go off, and I'd seen him a few weeks earlier at Mildura when I'd been up there to watch a bout, and I wasn't expecting to fight him. I've arrived at the fights this particular night, and the bloke that he was supposed to fight wasn't available. He'd had his jaw dislocated the previous night by someone else, and I said, don't worry, I'll jump in, I can knock this bloke out. 2 ups, don't worry about that. I said, I'll just give it to him. So here we go, here's the story. I've got a set of 8-ounce Mexican red leather Casanova boxing gloves in my bedroom. They're arranged in pairs on a narrow glass display shelf, about chest height, alongside my bed. I've had those gloves since August 1969, when Louis Sarre and I slipped them on for a prelim bout to an Australia junior middleweight title fight at the Theberton Town Hall. I got done, stopped, ended the first round too. Nothing to brag about, it seems. Unless, of course, you want to sit there quietly and watch 3 minutes roll around the sweep hand of your watch. A lot of punches can be thrown in that time, hard punches. It can be brutal. I've hung on to those gloves for more than 30 years, and they've moved around with me. Not just through that infamous bout, but through a couple of houses, as well as a couple of marriages. I haven't kept much, but I've kept them. I keep them displayed on that glass shelf to remind me of what I'm not quite so sure. I think they are there to remind me of what a savage sport I got involved in. Though it could be a bit of the old Anzac spirit too, celebrating the loss, knowing that I went in hard against the odds at the time. Not hard enough though, eh? Listen, I don't want to make too many excuses, but I wasn't expecting to fight that night. Gary Brand had his jaw dislocated the previous night sparring with Des Pearce at Max Hall's gym. That left them a man short on the program. So I jumped in. Simple as that. No training, nothing. I dead set thought I could knock Louis out in the first round if I stormed out of that blue corner and gave it to him. And I nearly did too. I had his knees buckling, but I just punched myself out. I simply ran out of steam and Louis came good. Louis and I laugh about it now. We're old men with an old and enduring friendship. We don't laugh together at the fights though. Neither of us go anymore. Haven't for years. We used to go together through the 70s, but we'd seldom run into too many blokes that we knew, other than trainers and officials. Funny how if you go to the footy or the cricket, the joint is usually chock-a-block with old players. Old boxers don't seem to follow the sport in the main. It's usually just a young crowd, and not a very large one either. You can draw your own conclusions as to why.
Geoff, the minute hand is coming around to the top of the hour, and I've got 2 generic questions to finish. But now that we've got to the end of most of those readings. There is one more I want to take you back to, and that is the relationship you had with migrants, particularly a Latvian migrant. I'd like you to tell us a little bit about this wonderful man and his nickname for you.
What page? His name was Harry. And this story is called What Harry Taught Me. For a butcher, Harry was a classic dresser in the traditional European sense. He was in his late 40s when we met, and I was just a kid. Harry had been in Australia for only a handful of years when we began working together in 1965. He was the first Latvian I'd ever met, and he captivated me with his style and old-fashioned mannerisms. He was so different from Mike, a fourth-generation Australian and the shop manager, and nothing at all like Frank, a little Cockney bloke who spent most of his time on the counter, charming the ladies with his rhyming slang and clever use of language. Dick and Johnny, the backroom butchers, were a couple of knockabouts, more likely to read a newspaper than a novel. Harry always wore a crisp white shirt with a black bow tie under his white butcher's coat and striped apron. His jet black hair was slicked down, and he had a pencil-lined moustache that looked as though it had been drawn on. I'd just turned 16, but I'd never seen anyone who looked like Harry, except perhaps in a black and white movie. He had a really heavy accent, and within minutes of meeting me, nicknamed me Sviveldash. I asked him why he chose to call me that. What did it mean? Don't worry why. From now on, you're Sviveldash, and that is all there is to it. Now get me the rump and the clean try, Sviveldash. Don't muck around. I try to teach you something. And it continues on. Listen, Sviveldash, you don't want to be backroom butcher breaking up the beef and doing the hard work. You should be shop butcher. I will teach you the window dress. I am the best. I can make easy your life. Harry taught me to save the prime slices for the front and top, and to always bury the poorer cuts on the underside at the back of the tray. One night as I came back from placing a tray of rump in the window display, Mike said, "Tell Harry to send out a tray of porterhouse after summer lamb chops." As Harry was putting the final touches to the lamb by adding a couple of sprigs of parsley, I asked him why they called it summer lamb. Harry winked and said, "Summer lamb and summer hogget." Now quick, go Sviveldash, take us this tray while I cut the porterhouse, and please find out what they want next. I came back out, grabbing a full topside from the rack in the cool room. Harry was sharpening his steak knife on the steel as I laid the topside on the wooden block. He went straight to work on it, trimming it and observing it from a few angles. By the time I'd got a fresh tray, he'd started slicing it and was soon laying out the slices. Sviveldash, watch me, you can learn. Remember, the customer is always standing at the front of the tray. And Sviveldash, if you are serving the customer and the customer wants your top layer or the piece right at the front, make sure you rest one finger on the scales when you weigh for price. Fuck them. If they fuck up your display, you make them pay. This is the only way. Learn it.
Geoff, I can see you in a James Bond movie as the villain.
I'd like to be there.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have just about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to go to a question that came through on the internet, which is more about the influence you've had, Geoff, over the years with your poetry, going into schools and workplaces, particularly with young people. How does it help, and has it helped young people through your poetry?
Well, I think it has, because it has allowed. I go to state schools and I go to private schools, and I guess when I go to state schools, if I go to state schools on the outskirts of Adelaide, I'll be reciting poetry about a lifestyle that kids know particularly well. There are poems on domestic violence, poems on drug and alcohol abuse, poems on hotel violence, a range of other issues. There are poems on ice. I've got a number of poems on ice amphetamines. And I woke up this morning, turned on the ABC News, and the first item that come up was the fact that South Australia is still the ice capital of Australia. And I guess, I've got some terrific poems on ice that I read to kids in state schools and private schools, and I know that kids have listened to those poems very carefully and realise that there are better choices to make than going down that path. There are other kids too that have had enough courage then to say to me, look, my brother's on ice. We don't know what to do. No one does. So what I do is make people think and show them too often that they are not aliens, that the things that are going on in their life, if I'm writing about these really hard issues, those issues often aren't spoken about in general. I was waiting for a couple of people who are in court all the time, day in and day out, and not at the back of the court, they're at the front of the court. And I was having lunch with them on Tuesday. And while I was waiting for them to arrive, there was a barrister from Bar Chambers sitting there with a young solicitor, and he called me over and we had a bit of a chat, and he introduced me to the girl, and the girl said, we've already met. And I said, where do we meet? And she said, I met you at Pembroke in 2015. And she said, are you still writing that great poetry? And I said, yes, I am, and I've got a memoir as well. So, I run into these people all the time that will remember what I've had to say, and poetry is not going to change the world, but poetry can be a catalyst for change. It can allow people to come out and write their own story too, and for the first time tell their own story. One night, middle of last week, I got a phone call, probably 2 o'clock in the morning, from a girl in Tasmania, a woman in Tasmania. And she was in tears and she was angry, and she said a doctor at the Launceston Hospital that's worked there for 20 years in the children's ward has just been arrested for abusing children. Now, this girl knew me. She's a woman now of 45, and she knew me when she was a 15-year-old girl at Riverside High School in Tasmania. And she was able to confide in me that she had been abused. And I was able to help her write that story. And I'm still in touch with that girl, and I'm still in touch, and I'm in touch too with her children. So poetry can have a reach.
You've taken your poetry to institutions, detention centres with kids. Can they write? What do you encourage them to do?
I definitely encourage them to write. I was at Ashley Youth Detention Centre in Tasmania last year, and 8 kids come in and they're slouching in their chairs like I am now. But I can tell you, by the time I was about 10 lines into a poem, they'd sat upright, and by the time I finished, they'd come to the edge of the chair, and I got a fabulous poem, and the poem is called Life with Jaden. It's on a postcard outside in the foyer, so grab one of them on your way out. The other postcard there is called True Love. It's about a 13-year-old boy on ice. And some people will think, a 13-year-old boy on ice, that's impossible. But it's not impossible. This is reality. And, I just wish the Education Department in South Australia had enough guts to get someone like me into state schools in the far northern and far southern suburbs to talk about these things. But there's no courage there.
Geoff, the time has come around for us to finish tonight. I'm very sad about that. We could speak for another hour.
Easily.
I do have one more question. It's probably the one that a lot of people would be interested in relation to where you're going to go with the next volume, or are you calling it quits? Where are you now with your next adventure?
Well, if this book can sell 10,000 copies, they'll... No, I'm not bullshitting you, you know, like that's how it is. It's going to have to sell 10,000 copies. If it doesn't sell 10,000, there won't be another book. Simple as that.
You've got more stories though, haven't you?
I've got plenty more stories. I've got loads of them.
I think we finish here at about 17 years of age, so
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
some
yeah.
time to go.
Might have a bit of a quantum jump, though, to where the next one starts, because that wasn't a very good patch of my life from 17 to 34. I was a naughty boy, and so we might jump that, and we'll... There's a good book, a good book from when I'm a poet onwards, you know, and I've still been a bit of a naughty boy there too, but a better quality naughty boy.
We'll call it redemption. I can see it now. Ladies and gentlemen, Geoff Goodfellow.
Thank you.